Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to look at two new units that, at least in name, seem to be declaring that they're new members of the Trebuchet family, the Traction Trebuchet and the Mounted Trebuchet. The trouble with Trebs is the devs just tripled the number of them, so we'll check out how they work and compare both new units to the vanilla Trebuchet as well as the bombard cannon to see how they fit in. Is one or both a blend of the two, or are they just kind of their own things entirely? To dive right in, the Mounted Trebuchet, which is the one with camels, is specific to Ketons, created from their siege workshop in Imperial Age, and seems more explicitly to be a replacement for the bombard cannon, as Ketons lack that unit, but still have the regular Trebuchet from the castle. The Traction Trebuchet, in contrast, is for the Three Kingdom civs, and while it's also made at the siege workshop, is instead the only thing that the Shu, Wei, and Wu have to perform either the Trebuchet or bombard cannon role, as they don't get either of those units. So even before looking at their stats, we have some subtle indications of their intended roles by noting what else is missing. To start a four-way comparison with their cost, all four of these are fairly expensive, in the 350 to 450 resource range per unit, with the Mounted Treb being the most unusual for having a bit of a food cost. I have heard camels eat food, so maybe it's not a big surprise, and whether the catapult on their back is made of food or gold is up to your own imagination. The Trebuchet has the highest attack and range, as well as 250 anti-building bonus damage, and is the only one that requires packing and unpacking, so it's the most cumbersome, but seemingly also the most anti-building. The Traction Trebuchet then has less attack, a smaller bonus against buildings, slightly less range, and doesn't have the same extreme pierce armor, but on the other hand doesn't need to unpack, giving the impression it's a lighter hitting but more mobile version of the Trebuchet. For its part, the bombard cannon then has even less attack and range, but a faster firing rate, faster speed, and its bonus damage is spread between not just buildings, but also includes siege and ships. It's always felt like a compromise between solid anti-building utility, but also appears to be more anti-unit. And if anything, the Mounted Trebuchet then goes even more in that anti-unit direction, which is 10 bonus damage against buildings and even less range, but keeping that blast radius of the bombard cannon, and is in fact even slightly faster and has a greater bonus against siege. I don't think it's a coincidence that as the units here get faster, they get shorter range as a trade-off, and get more of an anti-unit flavor. If you look at this as a spectrum from anti-building on the left to anti-unit on the right, that intuition won't lead you too far astray. In terms of some more hidden differences going on behind the scenes, they're all roughly in the same ballpark for creation speed, being fairly slow to produce, though notably the Traction Trebuchet takes the longest, and the Mounted Trebuchet is the shortest to create. Another hidden difference is their accuracy against units, ranging from 15% for the Trebuchet to then 30% for the Traction Treb, and then 100% for the other two, reinforcing that building versus anti-unit spectrum. As a side note, the Trebuchet and Traction Trebs also cut trees, while the others don't, making another subtle line of distinction between the two, with the Wu in particular after unique tech being actually not so bad at cutting through trees at all. Interestingly, only the Trebuchet has to be converted by monks from close range, which is actually a bit unfortunate for the Traction Treb for the Three Kingdom civs, making them easier to convert during Treb wars or when attacking castles. In terms of upgrades, only the bombard cannon requires chemistry to unlock, and none of these benefit from researching ballistics, though in fairness, unmanned siege equipment and camels aren't exactly known for in-depth calculations on moving targets either in reality. Siege Engineers is a good idea to pick up for all of these units though, if it's available, mostly for the +1 range, though the 20% extra bonus damage against buildings never hurts either. Notably, the Mounted Trebuchet's camel benefits from cavalry armor upgrades and husbandry as well, which more likely than not as Ketons you'll already be getting anyway, as they're a pretty strong cavalry-focused civilization. Highlighting that unit for a moment, the Mounted Trebuchet also has a unique ability to deal burning damage to an area after it fires, which for 8 seconds deals 2 damage per second to enemy units and 4 damage per second to buildings, ignoring armor. This effect doesn't stack, and an area is either burning or it's not, but you can maintain the fire on an area continuously if you keep attacking it, though for their own part, obviously units can try to get out of the fire to minimize its effect. On the other hand, the Traction Trebuchet comes in a few unique flavors. First off, the Shu have a bonus so they move 15% faster, basically bringing them up to a bombard cannon speed while still having some extra range. The Wei then get a 25% discount on them, bringing them under 300 resources in total cost, while the Wu have a unique tech to give them 2 extra projectiles, which is pretty powerful and leads to 30 to 40% more damage against buildings while being more likely to hit units in a small group. The extra projectiles just have 10 melee attack, which is reduced by melee armor, so its strength depends a bit on what you're targeting. So that was an aggressive information bomb of stats and numbers, with most of it just reinforcing that basic dichotomy we touched on earlier. Now though, let's put all of them through a few tests and see how they perform both as something anti-building and anti-unit compared to each other in some different situations. To start pretty basic, against a building with no masonry or siege engineers involved, already the simplified descriptions start to break down, as the traction trebuchet in particular doesn't really fit in nicely as a blended unit. If we look at the damage over time being dealt by trebuchets and bombard cannons as a reference, the traction trebuchet right away is worse than either, only about 2/3 as good as the bombard cannon, and roughly half as good as the regular trebuchet over time, though the Wu after their relevant unique tech managed to make the numbers quite a bit better. The mounted trebuchet then completely falls off a cliff, being less than half as effective again. It's not as big of a surprise, but even puts them behind an onager, which has itself always leaned far more toward being anti-unit than anti-building, and has never pretended to be a trebuchet. At the least, the mounted trebuchet is better than a heavy scorpion against buildings, so it at least has that going for it. In case you're wondering, masonry and architecture have a pretty trivial effect on all four of these units, usually reducing damage by just 1 or 2%, though just to add insult to injury, disproportionately affects mounted trebuchets, picking on them even more. Clearly, the mounted trebuchet is the odd one out at destroying buildings, though the traction trebuchet is also pretty underwhelming. We could just leave things here and conclude the traction trebuchet is functionally just a worse trebuchet for being so much weaker against buildings, but I don't think we're done, as we need to see how all of these perform against units. To start simply, we have all of them here, including the Wu's stronger version of the traction Treb in green against identical groups of Arbalesters. Over time, it's pretty clear the mounted Treb is by far the most effective, and after a disappointing test against buildings, it's nice to see it bounce back. Keep in mind, both the bombard cannon and mounted trebuchet have some splash damage helping out against tightly packed units, and just watching one shot, you can see the fire damage compounding on top of that, in this case ending up doing over twice as much damage as the bombard cannon's single shot. Just imagine a decent sized group of these firing into 50 Arbalesters. In fact, why imagine? This is what it looks like, and it's pretty glorious. More important than archers though, is how these all do against siege. All of these comfortably outrange onagers, though critically the traction Treb by default are not able to one-shot them. That's a bit of a problem, and another strike against that new unit, though technically the Wu can one-shot them with a bit of luck once they have their 3 projectiles, again making a good case for that unique tech. In practice, trebuchets are probably the worst here, and mounted trebuchets seem like the best, as even if they have the shortest range, their faster speed makes them surprisingly easy to dodge with. If we bump things up to Siege Onager, the mounted trebuchet looks even better, being able to one-shot them if they stand around for the fire damage to work its magic, while the bombard cannon in contrast can't finish it off, which is one of those useful things to know if you have Siege Onager in a team game, and mounted trebuchets are something to watch out for. All the same things are true for heavy scorpions as well, where the fire damage lets the mounted Treb one-shot them, while the bombard cannon technically needs a little extra damage from another unit or a second shot. Something worth noting is that trebuchets have pierce attack, while the other units here deal melee damage. So where the trebuchet takes 45 shots to defeat a single siege ram, the rest need just 5 attacks, and the mounted trebuchet just 4 if the fire damage is included. Arguably the most important situation though is how they handle trebuchets in your classic Treb war. In all these cases, it doesn't matter which unit you have, they take 3 shots to bring down a trebuchet. That is, except for the mounted Treb, as the camel once again shows its anti-unit specialty and can get it down to 1 HP, which is 2 consecutive shots, and if you space them out in time a bit, you can do it in 2. On the other hand, an enemy trebuchet can one-shot most of these units in return, so you really need to use their mobility if you want to try picking off enemy Trebs, since all of them will of course be within range of return fire. A side note here is that a trebuchet beside or behind a castle actually gets a lot of protection against being sniped by mounted Trebs, since the camels don't technically outrange castles, and it can pay to be a bit strategic with your trebuchet placement. A similar sort of relationship to trebuchets also happens with bombard cannons as well, where the mounted trebuchet camel does the most damage and nearly takes it out in one hit, though in all these cases the bombard cannon can fire back, and you have to be a little careful, with the mounted trebuchet then being the only one that goes down in just 1 return shot. That initially won't make a lot of sense, as mounted trebuchets have 75 HP and 5 melee armor, against the bombard cannon's 40 melee attack plus 20 versus siege. It should end with 20 HP left, but instead drops after that one hit. So what's going on? It turns out the mounted trebuchet is one of a rare class of units that have heavy siege armor, which makes these a little extra sensitive to bombard cannons, the mangonel and rocket cart line, as well as villagers, as something to be aware of. In terms of some other examples of durability, the bombard cannon is by far the weakest to Arbalester shots, with the mounted trebuchet again a little weaker than the others, and the trebuchet is clearly the best at resisting those thanks to massive pierce armor. In fact, that's another way the traction trebuchet is much closer to the bombard cannon, if anything. The bombard cannon is in the weakest to melee attacks, like hussars, where again the trebuchet holds out the longest, though all of them are pretty weak against melee attacks in general. At the risk of muddying the waters too much with different cases, I think we're at a point we can draw some general conclusions from all of this. First off, for the traction trebuchet, its advantages are clearly that it has most of the range of a trebuchet, trading some damage against buildings for more mobility to escape things like bombard cannons, especially for the shoe, which move 15% faster. Against trebuchets in particular with some reasonable micro, you can win treb wars consistently, so I'm hesitant to just say they're a weaker trebuchet, where they almost feel more like a slower firing but longer range bombard cannon in a lot of the testing. The mounted trebuchet, for its part, then abandons the anti-building aspect almost entirely and becomes just a shorter range, more anti-unit feeling variant of bombard cannons. It's not a perfect description, but we saw them nearly two-shot trebuchets, one-shot scorpions, and siege onagers, as well as deal the most damage to arbalesters. So if you're looking for something to add in to perform that anti-unit bombard cannon role for Ketons, it's reasonably good at doing that. Interestingly then, despite both having trebuchet in their names, my impression is they're actually both closer to variants on the bombard cannon, with obviously quite a bit of nuance there. That'll do it for this quick comparison though, and sorry if the names were a little confusing to keep track of. I just went back and counted it up and said either Treb or trebuchet over 70 times in the video, but hopefully you could follow along which unit I was talking about for the most part. I didn't name them, so don't blame me. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.